Hello, welcome to our Saturday session of Armory Live. I just wanted to welcome you all. We're still getting used to being back in person, so which is a wonderful thing. It's great. We're also live streaming this, if for those that can't join, but we're thrilled to have a tremendous program for everyone this weekend, and just wanted to say that we're thrilled to have such talented speakers, and we're looking forward to a really great session. I also want to encourage you to go see the fair after, if you haven't already had a chance to explore, because there's a lot of fantastic art out there. I'd like to introduce Aisha Junior, who is going to be introducing our esteemed panelists this afternoon. So welcome and enjoy Armory Live.
Hello and welcome to Armory Live. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to open our program with our first panel discussion, Creating the Change, the Art of Art Advocacy. Excuse me. Drawing upon their direct experience working with creatives to tackle this challenge, moderator Thaddeus Stauber, head of Nixon Peabody LLC's Art and Culture Institution team, Liana Krupp, president of the Krupp Family Foundation, and Doug Lasdon, founder and executive director of the Urban Justice Center, will discuss a broad array of tools meant to empower the art community, equity, and justice advocacy efforts. New for this year, our Armory Live program is streaming live, so I'd also like to welcome our online viewers. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of the hour in which we will field questions from the room and from online. So please feel free to send your questions throughout the discussion. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our speaker. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Thaddeus Stauber, and it's really quite an honor for me to be here with Liana and Doug. And we're going to try to keep this a relatively casual format, speaking sort of back and forth, and we're going to share a few images with you. I started my legal career working as a public defender, a criminal defense lawyer. And it is through that I explored and started to understand that advocacy work is performance work in many ways. So I had the opportunity to work with Brian Stevenson. If you know Brian, who does the Equal Justice Initiative. And Brian was experiencing 15, 20 years ago when he'd walk into the Alabama courtroom as the lawyer representing the gentleman or lady, potentially going to death row. The judge would stop and ask him to leave the courtroom. Don't come in until the lawyers are ready. And Brian is black. And Brian was scratching his head and saying, how do you not understand that I am a Harvard-educated lawyer? I'm here to advocate. And it dawned upon him that he needed to create a performance piece. And so he reached out to law firms across the country, and he recruited about a dozen of us who had criminal backgrounds but were now working in private firms and who were white. And he said, your job is to come here, be the first lawyer that the judge sees in the courtroom, and come up behind your client and lay your hands upon the client and warm the court up to this person, humanize this person. And it was that performance that started changing the course of where those cases would go. So when Eliza approached me about the idea of art and advocacy, I thought about that performance piece. And I thought, what a neat idea or interesting idea it would be to bring together sort of the jury on one side, in many ways. Liana, who runs a family foundation that supports social justice causes and others, but is also an art collector and is impacted by art. And how does the art move her? And then we have Doug with the Urban Justice Center, who is the advocate. And how is the advocate utilizing art to push their message across? And are they doing it in an effective way, or what other tools could they use? As your moderator, I'm somebody who has the good fortune to work with Lauren Halsey, who you see on the recent cover of Art Forum. and her Summa Everything Community Center, which I'm proud to say we helped found, and has been providing 500 meals a week in South Central Los Angeles. And in, as you read in Art Forum, it's an inspiration for Lauren's artwork, whereas the artwork is not an inspiration necessarily for the community center. So where and how is this all coalescing? So I want to start with Doug and ask Doug, do you think, or do you use art in your work as a disruptor or as an affirmer, or what role does it play in helping you push your message forward?
All of that. Oh. Is this? Oh, we use art in all those ways. I had some prepared remarks, which I don't have to give, but one of the lines is artists can educate, illuminate, deconstruct, and disrupt. So depending on your purpose, depending on the artists involved, it can do all of that, and we need to use art to do all of that. My favorite, of course, hopefully being a more aggressive advocate, is the disruption of art, and I think that helps us move forward as a society to become more just. As a lawyer, I use the law to disrupt and to change unjust systems. Artists can do the same thing through their art.
So from a collector's perspective, where and how have you found instances where a moment with art, a moment with an artist has maybe shifted your perception of something or galvanized you to take action?
Well, these two right here, Castles and Rafa Esparza, are a really great example of how my experience as a collector and a patron personally sort of informs how I move through the world and informs our philanthropic practice as well. They did a project in plain sight where they had 80 plus artists of multinational, multicultural, multigender identities, sky typing messages over ICE detention centers around the country. And I was so unaware of what was happening in plain sight, that these places were in corporate parks around the country, right next to stadiums. And while I am not necessarily an immigration justice funder, I have a different perspective of the world because of this work. And that project came out of Four Freedoms, which is an organization started by Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Gottesman. And at the Four Freedoms Congress, which happened right before the pandemic shut everything down, they introduced the work and did a workshop with their artists. And it was sort of a beautiful combination of my personal interests and my professional interests. Our foundation has been funding Four Freedoms for about 5 years since their 50 States, 50 Billboards project. And we sort of stepped in and said, let's help you with the strategic plan. This can go so much further than just this project. We committed a large dollar multi-year grant, and we've been really consistent in being flexible and supporting them in their growth of their infrastructure. And Castle's process, post in plain sight, they set up a trans and non-binary artist fund at Four Freedoms, which we recently made a match gift to help seed. So it's this really interesting concentric circle where all of these artists sort of work together in a collaborative nature and inform both projects, really important issues that are happening in the world that, as a white woman who spent the first 35 years of my life in the Northeast, I didn't know anything about the border. I didn't know anything about immigration in the way that Rafa's work speaks about. And you'll see some images from his show at Ballroom Marfa in 2017, Tierra Sangre Oro. And that is where it all changed for me. It was the first time that I saw art that moved me in a way that I learned about something, and I became really impressed with his sense of community and bringing folks together and collaborating with other artists. And I think that's sort of the ongoing theme in how we do our philanthropy.
So Doug, picking up on that, okay, so you've heard that the collector, the philanthropist is moved, motivated to take some action. by an artist's effort. You've been taking action here in New York City and elsewhere, really on the ground, on issues that people, they're divisive, or like, why would you get behind this issue, for example?
Yeah.
You know, sex workers. How do you get up on a Monday morning and say, I think I'm going to go advocate for sex workers?
That's easy for me, and the reason it's easy for me is, well, we started our sex work project 20 years ago, and 20 years ago, no one would talk about prostitutes. You can't you can't have a conversation. It was the politicians would not, if a politician mentioned that we need to look at sex workers and see what help they might need, or maybe we change the laws, they're not going to be an elected politician anymore. So we have watched this for 20 years, and I remember when a woman named Juhu Thukral came to me 20 years ago and said, I want to start a sex worker project, and I immediately said, fabulous. And the reason I immediately said fabulous was because no one was talking about it, and no one was helping them. And I know that when no one is talking about it or helping them, there are myths, lies, mistruths, which is the same as a lie, and injustices, and somebody needs to stand up. Now, it's 20 years later, and the district attorneys are talking about it. There are different approaches around the world. We don't have that many different approaches yet in the United States, and our sex worker project is doing legal advocacy and using art. And
So talk a little bit about that, because here you had a docuseries. You know, these are images that people maybe associate with a Mapplethorpe, or you know, a strong, aggressive work that confronts them.
yes, well, that's what we need now. Lawyers can bring a case, kind of change a system, but if we're really going to transform society towards a more just place, we need artists to step in, because they can do more than lawyers. They can help change.
Wait a minute. They can do more than lawyers.
They can do more than lawyers.
You just dropped my hourly rate.
Yes. But they can, what we're really trying to do as advocates is change hearts and minds. And lawyers can help inform through our cases, but it's much more limited. Artists can, as I said, educate, confront, disrupt, deconstruct, and through their art, get society and culture to change in ways that lawyers are not as effective.
So you were picking up on that lawyers have a role and an approach, but you don't spend time talking to lawyers, do you? You spend time talking to artists.
I talk to you.
You do, and I appreciate that.
I'm not a
but
lawyer.
But on a
so-
day-to-day basis,
Yeah,
or you seek out artists, don't you?
Absolutely. And sometimes the message comes before the artist, and other times the artist opens up the world of a different message. So Carolina Caicedo is a Colombian artist who her work is based around waterways and indigenous practices. This is at MCA Chicago. And her approach has been so shifting in how we talk about conservation and not just climate crisis. And there's another slide here of a Tara Donovan piece that was at another ballroom show called Hyperobjects, that really the idea of hyperobjects is based on a philosopher by the name of Timothy Morton, who co-curated this show, and it was art objects and non-art objects, discussing climate change and climate crisis as such a big problem that it affects all of us, and we need to look at it in a different way, because we're losing empathy for ourselves as a human race. And to be confronted with 100,000 plastic cups just sitting there looking beautiful as an object, where do these go? What does this happen? How you sit with questions about an issue that you might not be thinking about every day. And the power of art is building empathy. I am a firm believer that art is the voice of many revolutions, and similar to what Doug was saying, if you don't have consensus power, and if you don't give people the power to demand that change, you guys really have your work cut out for you as lawyers. If people are not demanding it, no, the things will not actually happen.
And that's what it takes for the change. And that's what I'm talking about. Artists will, as a lawyer, I might be able to force the Armory, force the city to stop putting homeless people in Armory shelters. But how do we get people to really care about the homeless? And if as a society, we demand that we take care of homeless properly, then we won't just be shutting down the Armory. We will be creating the system we need. And that is much harder to do as lawyers, although we do get good things done.
But so here's an example of this, the Legal Action Center for the Homeless poster, back from 1987, right? So what we're talking about here today isn't necessarily new, is it? I mean, the use of imagery in advocacy in a way that's very compelling.
Well, I wish I was a historian because I could answer that question better, but I can go back to 1987 because this was one of my projects. I was representing homeless people, and there were homeless people, I don't know how many people can remember back when they were in New York City really sleeping on every block. And the city wasn't doing anything, and Ed Koch was the mayor, and it made me angry, and I wanted to express that anger, and I met an artist, Paul Marcus, and I saw his very powerful charcoal drawings, and he agreed to do this drawing, and we took it and put it up in the subways, and we confronted people with it. I don't know if anybody can read it. I don't remember, but I just want to read the, just so you understand what it's expressing, but it says, this is from John Locke. All excess is usurpation in the sight of the needy ought to awaken remorse in the soul of the wealthy. Perverse men, you who roll in riches and pleasures, tremble lest one day the wretched who lack the necessities of life apprehend fully the rights of man. But it was an angry poster, and it was meant to change. This was meant to disrupt and deconstruct.
And did it, in fact?
You know, I can't say it changed everything. I think in order to do that, we need a bigger movement saying that. And I've looked at what triggers a movement like that. I'm sorry to say it wasn't the poster, but I think it needed to be expressed and people needed to see it. So we did.
Liana, going back to you, this I see a relationship here between this poster, frankly, and the skywriting that you were talking about and sharing with us, and how that moved you. Because as you were saying, as somebody who grew up in the Northeast and in that area, and now you live in Venice Beach, without this skywriting or without that poster, frankly, you weren't aware of these things.
No, and that's my privilege to learn about these things later on in life, and you can't unsee what you see once you start learning about these things. Again, that empathetic touch that happens when art actually moves a person to learn. And the beautiful thing about this project was that there was a social interaction that the artists actually moved resources, money to bail funds and legal aid for immigrants in these detention centers throughout the country. So it was really this big social impact that they had that went beyond just having this large-scale, ambitious art project that people didn't know what was going on when they were seeing the sky typing. Similar, and kind of to tie it to the homeless poster, there's an image here from the Four Freedoms Congress of a woman holding a poster from Amplifier, which is an organization that I became familiar with through Four Freedoms. They're a partner, and they create these beautiful images. If you recall the first Women's March, there were a bunch of Shepherd Ferry posters, We the People, that sort of started it. And they create these educational processes around them to have discussions for classrooms, for K through 12 curriculums, and they just create beautiful images. And sometimes, whether they're used in protests, whether people are collecting them, they're an easy access point to inspire someone to want to know more. What is this?
Could I go back to your comment, did our poster disrupt and the whole system? I think it's the rare art piece or the rare anything that you put it out there and the system moves and the system changes. And I think what I would say the goal was, and the goal for a lot of this is, I want to and I don't want to say to change people's hearts and minds one person at a time. Now, I don't want to say that because hopefully we can do it more than one person at a time, but a lot of this is one person at a time, and if we could slowly build the movement, I don't think anything changes, the next day we start, Doug put up that poster and now we're going to provide all the right housing and sports services. But in New York, that was a piece of the movement, and we actually did in New York make a lot of progress in forcing the city and state of New York to put the resources towards supportive housing, something I hope California learns, and really San Francisco more than LA from what I can tell. But we were effective at that in New York, and we had all of this coming together, and the system did significantly improve.
So this poster or work from 1967 makes me think about what I was mentioning earlier, Brian Stevenson, an Equal Justice Initiative, and they've pushed forward and opened a museum. And in addition to that, they had a project in which they wanted to create a plaque or a noose symbol everywhere in the South where somebody was lynched. And the pushback to utilizing that imagery was tremendous. In fact, cities brought litigation to try to stop it. But I think that was an example of putting a really disruptive image and remembrance in front of people and saying, this did happen here. We are going to acknowledge this. And that's where a visual changed hearts and minds and pushed people.
The truth is important and sometimes difficult, but needs to be told. I do want to say that this is here because this was here. This is here again because the Urban Justice Center. We believe in art, and we believe in the power of art to change us more towards a just society. And we have art at the at the Urban Justice Center, and we did a show of Emory Douglas, and I have a list here. We've done many fabulous shows by terrific social artists, and this was one of them.
Liana, let's talk a little bit, shifting it from the perspective of a collector, okay? And some of these works, like the skywriting work, that's an ephemeris work. It's going to be gone tomorrow. How do you collect this work? How do you how do you commission this work? Where's the financial value in this work to the collector? And does that matter?
It doesn't matter to me. We supported this through our staff's executive contingency fund, this project specifically, and because we saw the presentation, we knew the artists, we were here for the collaborative nature. And for me, the impact there really was how many people saw that, and how even I'm not 100% sure what the final impact was financially for the organizations that they were moving money towards, but the fact that I was making donations to every fund that they were recommending every single day. It would be an action list in every city that they would do of, here are your 10 organizations that you support. And it was the pandemic. I moved a lot of money personally to these bail funds and immigration funds, and learned a lot. And it's the era of GoFundMes, and you end up on mailing lists, and then you start finding out more, and you become more engaged. And it's really a matter of that I find this kind of work as experiential, and it moves forward, and it introduces you to new artists and new organizations as well.
I want to pick up on that point because one of these things, this is coming back to Lauren Halsey, which we have the pleasure to work with. And what we experienced when she launched Some Everything was the idea we were going to build a community center. And in the last, just the last couple of months, very excited that Lauren was able to purchase a property in South Los Angeles for her studio. And will also ultimately have the community center at the studio. Now, keeping them together but separate, if that makes sense, right? Because one's a nonprofit entity. We don't want to blur the lines because she has a very significant commercial practice. And you'll have the pleasure of seeing her work here in New York at a major museum in 2022, and then also in London, an institution there that not quite yet announced yet, but very exciting opportunities, commissions for her. One of her objectives is owning her agency, and the artists owning their agency and owning property in the communities in which they work, and changing the conversation with the community through employing individuals, training individuals, and frankly, building generational wealth that for many artists who come, depending on their background or their race, don't have that. Right? And so art is a way to actually build generational wealth. And when you have generational wealth, Liana, what can you do with it? You can...
I mean, the idea that culture informs economic status, informs political status. I think that regardless of Lauren's success, Some Everything would have happened no matter what. She loves her neighborhood. She is so of the people there. And she has been able to sort of just, move into the space of mutual aid during the pandemic that a lot of folks don't understand. A lot of white funders don't understand. Why is this artist giving away food? And it's like, because that's what her people need right now. That's what her neighbors need and her family needs. And I think that's really what it's all about, is being able to sort of expand upon and be inclusive of other folks and be able to help build pathways through jobs, through hiring people to work within her studios, to help other people platform their artistic practice. And the common thread through so many of these artists that I've spoken about and that I adore is that they have community practice. And that is something that I always look for, whether that's an organization or an artist, is who do you work with? Who's in the room with you? And who are you accountable to? Are you accountable to, your gallery and your institutions that are selling your work? Or are you accountable to bringing that success back home? And I think that there's a lot of examples of residencies and community centers that have superstar artists who really have been able to build that. And coming from Boston originally, we don't necessarily have that superstar artist per se. Mm-hmm. And I work with a community center in Dorchester, Massachusetts called The Guild that's very similar to what Lauren does at Some Everything, that had to make this huge pivot for a pandemic for mutual aid, but the same thing. It's all about community ownership. It's all about owning that real estate and redeveloping the properties themselves and having this community process that allows not necessarily new ways of doing things, just ways that aren't top-down and aren't paternalistic.
Yeah. So we're experiencing a couple issues that we're trying to navigate through with Some Everything right now, which was that, initially with the pandemic and the popularity of the imagery and the practice, funds came in. I mean, before we could even get the nonprofit formed, they were coming in. We had to try, you had to race to make sure people were giving regardless of a tax deduction. Well, people now think the crisis has sort of passed. And so those $25, $50, $100, $1,000 that was just coming in quickly has really started to tail off. And so that we're trying to confront is, how do we build for the long run? How do we make this a sustainable community service project? And the thought there was, we got to put our stake in the ground, and Lauren's stepping up to buy property to do that. But in that process, we were finding that she would call on properties and not get callbacks. And so she reached out, and not to give away, confidence here, but we started calling, i.e. my office started calling, and my assistant, Heidi Gutierrez, started calling on my behalf to get us meetings to see properties. And can you imagine how that worked? We got meetings. We saw all the properties we wanted to see. And Lauren would come with me, and the conversation would initially shift with a little just turn of the head. Well, who's really buying this property? Does this person really have the kind of resources to do this? And we would go to work on the owners and talk to them about some everything, and talk to them about her practice, and talk to them about the financing we were going to be able to secure. But I thought, oh my gosh, I've kind of come full circle here, right? I was public defending in Alabama, standing behind somebody just to give them an imprimatur, and here we are now, almost 20 years later, and doing the same thing, because of the perception over the reality that this is somebody who actually can afford to buy a studio property. And you actually want this person in your community, and you want them doing this, and you want them improving the land, and you want them employing people. But Doug, let's talk a little bit about how you have infused artists into your advocacy. You mentioned some curatorial programs that you've done, or some exhibitions you've done. What is the role actually of the artist inside of the Urban Justice Center?
That depends on the particular project, on the particular need. I actually have 4 examples. I'll actually start. I see Doreen over there runs our mental health project, and they run monthly open mic nights for people, for their New York City community, people with mental health concerns and friends. And it provides an opportunity for the community members to gather and share their talents through song, music, stories, poetry, and spoken words. The evenings of artistic sharing were joyful, provided inspiration and support to everyone who attended, and showed that they are a resilient community. I have to say, I'm reading this because in preparation, we have 11 or 12 projects. You'd think I'd know, but I don't, because they come and go. But I sent a note for people running the projects to say, how are you using artists right now? And Doreen sent me this note. Thank you, Doreen. Our street vendor projects, many street vendor project members are artists selling their work on the streets of New York. Street vendor project leaders have been expressing the impact of the injustice that exists in the vending system on them in many creative ways, from banners and signs that visualize their issues to creating artistic scenes to explain a complicated issue to the public. Our domestic violence project every year holds a session around the holidays, at the holidays, to take pictures, because when they escape their abusers and they don't have pictures of them and their children. So they get together and they take these beautiful pictures that helps them to envision their families as strong, beautiful, loving, and sending them out into the world. Of course, the sexual healing is a docu-series created by our Sex Worker Project, which aspires to shift the way we see sex and sexuality in our society through the eyes of sex work experts and educators, highlighting the range of experience of people in the sex trades. It will be featured in the Berlin Porn Film Festival in October. It will be part of the Museum of Sex's show Reclaiming and Making Art, Desire, Violence, and they will have I think you might be able to call it a performance piece, a red carpet beforehand, which will be very exciting and interesting. And again, getting people to see how a different vision of sex work in society. And it has a premiere this week on Thursday. I think that's Thursday, 9/16 at the Roxy, if anybody wants to go see the premiere of Sexual Healing. So those are just examples going on this week that our project directors sent.
I want to come back to the role of the collector in this conversation. And the particular work that you were sharing here that at the MCA, I have to confess, the work on the, I guess my right, your left, you see the white and there's a yellow one. That actually is owned by my wife, Tracy O'Brien, who sends her regards today. And the one in the middle is owned by another friend of ours also in Venice, that was taken and exposed to the work through my wife, Tracy. These works of art are not cheap, Liana, and they take a lot of care to take care of. There's an interesting message there, but they're also work that is not, in traditional sense, pretty, right? How is it, or why are you as a collector drawn to this kind of work? I mean, do you have art education background? How is this visually, and how do you get educated about why this is art versus a simple...
It's funny because I have a lot of imposter syndrome as a collector, as an art patron, as a woman sitting up here who's not a lawyer, that this kind of work is important, and I learn about it through the artists, through the institutions that are exhibiting them, whether that's group shows or solo shows, and really spending the time. I'm really grateful. My education is, I got my education in contemporary art from my in-laws, Lisbeth and George Krupp. And they taught me that if you're interested in something, find a way to get to know the artist, get to know their gallery, get to know the curators that work with them. And it really informed how our philanthropic practice works of getting to know an entire staff, getting to know partners, getting to know communities being served by organizations. And it's a very similar thing where you just find yourself in conversation. And it's not easy, and it's a point of privilege to be able to go and have dinner with an artist when you're at an art fair in Bogota. Or even here in New York, or stop by a booth and see Kambui Olujiwi has a booth here, a solo booth, and I've known him for years I met him at a party for Ballroom, and he works with Four Freedoms. He actually started a soup truck that was serving people during the pandemic through the Wide Awakes at Four Freedoms, and I like to say that I'm in the business of people. It's people first, it's relationships first, and it's being in right relationships, and just how do you show up and just build trust with people? Because this is not necessarily work that I have lived experience with, nor is Rafa's, or nor is Beatrice Cortez's, but I've gotten to know them in a way that it speaks so deeply, and I want that to be a reminder. I want the harder pieces to be a reminder to myself to always remember the stories that they've shared, whether that's around the ingenuity of immigrant laborers or the struggle of borderland life or ecological and indigenous practices that, they become sort of talismans in a way. Outside of my socially conscious art collection, it's a lot of geometric abstraction and like very pretty linear things and lots of bright colors and, kind of like a magpie almost. But this work can be very challenging, and it's always fun to have those arguments with my husband of what makes sense and what doesn't. But I have a good support system around me to help it prevail. And it's just been really meaningful to me to sort of be able to steward things. I worry a lot about, and not to step on toes of artists like Lauren, I really worry about market-driven art and speculation, and the art that I've been buying from these artists it's stuff that I want to have forever, and it's stuff that I feel that I'm being trusted and taken care of. And that means loaning it out when institutions want to feature it. It means making sure that I'm not selling it on a secondary market on these very specific pieces, because they've become intimate to me and they mean something.
But the secondary market arguably drives the primary market. And so you do need, it's interesting, I have the good fortune of working with a number of artists at different levels. From a Jonas Wood, Sterling Ruby, Lauren Halsey, We have the privilege to work with Tim Burton, who people don't necessarily think of as a fine artist, but his show at MoMA many years ago is the number 2 or 3 show of all time at MoMA, okay? And we recently did a show with him in Las Vegas at the Neon Museum. And if you travel to Korea, you can see a show of his coming up. We're working on another project. So my point is, at the different ladders and spots, these artists do need secondary sales. So at some point, does the collector have an obligation to share that work with the market and have it sell nicely so the primary market can move up? Or is that served
I'm not
through
sure I'm smart enough to
loaning?
answer that question. I'm a baby collector, and for me, it's really at this point as I'm emerging and stepping into these spaces, it really is about figuring that out and figuring out what you make space for and how you share that and how you pivot that. And I don't disagree with you, but I also think a lot about how the secondary market can work against the artist in terms of their immediate value and also sort of the mental strain that suddenly you're this multi-million-dollar selling artist. How do I actually create multi-million-dollar art now? Because my primary market's higher, and there's a lot of pressure and a lot of it stagnates creative process sometimes. Some people thrive in it, but there are also artists who suffer through it because they are suddenly so popular in auction. They're afraid to make new work because will it be worth that? Not so much that they won't get paid for it, that they don't think that their artistic output will be at that value.
I think what we're going to start seeing is, and I'm seeing it now with a number of the artists we work with or others that are in estates that are coming to market, the impact of building wealth and how they deploy that wealth in a very meaningful way, and some of the projects like yours, Doug, or others, I think there's going to be some real big opportunities where the art community can get behind certain initiatives and really move the proverbial needle because they think they're important, and now they have the financial wherewithal to help do that. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing with this innovation lab.
Thank you. We have this here because we believe in people doing cutting-edge work, and we believe in the power of individuals and groups to inspire, and we want to give them a platform from which to develop their ideas and their visions. And so at the Urban Justice Center, we have something called the Social Justice Accelerator, where we accept 5 early-stage social justice organizations into the accelerator and have a 2-year program to help them develop. We support them while we develop, and we just released the application for the new class now, and we would love to get artists, and it's not different, but artists and writers or poets or documentary makers in there, and there is room. And if I don't know who's watching this online, but please spread the word, and we'd love to welcome them into our office. The Innovation Lab is something we are trying to get off the ground by. That is a community, what is it? A common workspace for social justice organizations. They can come and they can share community and share ideas and have some of the harder back office stuff done for them so they can focus on their idea. And through this, we would love to, it's not up yet, it's a baby idea. One of the problems with the Social Justice Accelerator for artists is we don't offer a space to do their work.
Studio space.
Studio space. But I wonder if we can reclaim a building and bring in community and make it available for artists doing social justice work. And so we believe in supporting and promoting people who have ideas and visions and they want to effectuate it, and we want to be there to help them.
So speaking of help, right, and how to help people, can you give me or share with us what are the 2 or 3 characteristics that you see from successful either applicants or organizations you look at that are dovetailing a role for art in their philanthropy? What do you consistently see being successful?
Top line collaboration and partnership. It is a collective effort. It's not just one person driving the bus. It's a lot of people taking turns driving the bus and holding each other up. And I think it is very much, it really ties back to community. Who are they accountable to? Who am I accountable to? I'm accountable to my board, but they're right there, so they can they can cut the mic right now if they wanted to. But when you're an artist or an organization of artists who are trying to make a statement, trying to make a change in the world, it really is about who else is in there with you doing it and where you're touching that work. For Freedom started out as a pack. They wanted to have a nonpartisan, art-focused, civic dialogue. And now they are their own C3. They are rolling into an LLC separate from the C3 and really looking at opportunities to continue to have revenue generation on top of grant writing and grant making. So I love to dream big. I love to allow people the space to dream big and be hands-on in how we can help them work through that and how we can actually achieve those goals and those benchmarks that they determine and not so much someone fitting into the box that I want to see happen in the world.
I got to tell you, that's really exciting for me because you're going to hear later today a panel, for those of you who loop back, on entrepreneurship in the arts. And I think that picking up on your point and what we're trying to work through at the Summit Everything is we do not want to be dependent on the drip, drip, drip of grants. And Lauren is really pushing to figure out her own entrepreneurial practice and how does that help support Summit Everything, but not have it being dependent upon one artist, right? And what are other revenue sources that you can build into your model so that it does become self-sustaining and it turns over?
Yeah, there is a big movement today in monetizing doing good. And I can't help but, one way for artists to do that is perhaps to sell some of their work, and then that gives them the base from which to do other work that may not sell. And I can't help wondering why. I only walked around that side of the building here, but I didn't see any social justice-inspired art. And I wonder if, and I know nothing about the art market, but I wonder if there is room, and maybe we can inspire people with money to say that, oh, there is value in social inspired art, because there is. So I don't know why it's, and maybe there is a market and it's selling, and I just don't see it here. And I think people need to ask the powers here, why don't they have more socially inspired art here? If any. I didn't see any on that side. There may be some on that side.
Mm-hmm.
I'll point you to some.
Okay.
Well, I think that's part of what you were talking about earlier about getting your head around Carolina's work. And when you first look at it, do you just see beauty? Do you see something that lightens your day? Do you see something that catches your eye? Or do you see the message that she is talking about has to do with water and dams that are being used, and those are fishing nets, and how it's changing people's lives? When we first looked at that work, we first saw it actually in San Francisco at the Fog Art Fair with a friend of ours who has the gallery out of Bogota, right, and brought that work here. And it took her explaining it to us, Omaira, the wonderful curator but gallerist, with them, and walking us through what this work was about and what it meant. Now, it added value to the work for me, but I would say we were first just drawn to it because we thought it was a beautiful object. Isn't that what sort of grabs you first oftentimes?
Sometimes not. Sometimes it's the opposite, because I think the whole point of art is just that language of, or how are you responding to this? Sometimes I'm appalled or I don't get it and it challenges me, but I keep going back to it. Whether that's the metallic sculptures that Beatrice Cortez does, where for me, originally, I'm like, I don't understand it, or some of her more literal stuff around indigenous futures, I really got. But as I got to get to know Beatrice, who's one of the most brilliant thinkers I've ever met, and learn more about the process, learn more about how she's self-taught in welding, and how that's representative of so many immigrant people coming in and doing jobs that they're not taught how to do, but they're expected to work. And that makes the work more meaningful to me. And Carolina's works, she just had a show at Commonwealth and Council that a lot of it was around banknotes and different kinds of money. And I was so taken by the work that she did to sort of collage out this colonial narrative that is actually in our legal tender, and the language that we use around currency, trusts, and things like that. It was very connected to these very warm and kind words, but plenty of people think money is evil. So, playing with those dichotomies, would I know that if I didn't walk through with Carolina? I don't think so. Maybe with Kibama Young, but it is not something that initially I would have understood the full meaning of the piece, and it makes the work so much more richer when you take that response, whether that's a positive or negative to the aesthetic, and really ask the questions and interrogate why it's making you feel a certain way, and why you keep going back to it and why you hold on to it.
I think there's a moment in time right now too in the art community where the artist is asking, is this activist art? Is this message art? Or is it just art I'm making because that's the imagery that I live around? I mean, Monet painted water lilies because he saw water lilies, and we all think water lilies are beautiful. But Lauren Halsey, for example, if you look at her gypsum carvings, or you see the work, she has a work in the group show at Jeffrey Deitch, it's imagery from South Central Los Angeles that she sees every day riding her bike around. And to her, that's beautiful. She's not trying to tell you that something is right or something is wrong. She's just carving what she sees as an image that brings her warmth, and she wants to share it with you.
Sometimes we need to remove the top level Eurocentric vision of what good art is, and really, whether someone responds well to Lauren's work or not. I love Lauren's work. I understand that vernacular because of hip hop culture, because of living in Los Angeles and having friends who've grown up like that, in those areas, and really enjoying seeing that work show up in places. But for people who don't understand it, it is because they were never exposed to it, whether, like my experience directly is pop culture, as opposed to lived culture. And I think that there's a lot to be said about making space in the global art market for things that traditionally don't fit the Eurocentric view.
I mean, I think, Doug, as lawyers, what we often find, right, is the law tails society. I think we, as lawyers who have been, you have been at the forefront, almost your entire career, putting the issue forward, whether it's sex workers, tenants' rights, and getting out front of it and saying, no, we're going to talk about this, and building on that civil rights movement of we're going to use the law to change societal norms, whether, and then the law is going to uphold it and the courts are going to uphold it, and that's how we're going to change. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, So where and how do you think, coming off some of this conversation, you're going to be able to utilize some of the art or in different ways, or pushing the conversation stronger or harder?
I think that the one place I would direct people to, where we're doing it right now, is the Sex Worker Project. That it is a cutting edge. The way we see sex in society, it's very hard to change and very important to talk about. And so our sex worker project is out there in front. They're getting attention. They are doing a film. I encourage people to come to either the Roxy opening this week or the at the Museum of Sex in a few weeks. And I hope we will be part of the conversation of moving society forward in changing our views of sex and sex work. And I am going to go back and talk to our projects and encourage them to do more, but they seem to do it on their own. And our art is a critical part of what our work should be doing.
Well, with respect to the sex workers, I can say people who work on time, we're lawyers, so there's no shame in working on time.
Sex work's real work.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, time, we have a few minutes left, and we did want to give the audience here, who was kind enough to be with us today, an opportunity to either share a viewpoint, toss a question, tell us where you think this movement is going one way or the other. Anybody interested in joining our conversation?
First of all, your passion and your moral and your values and everything you're doing just makes me feel so good on especially 9/11. So thank you for that. So important to hear that you all are putting your money and your time in the right places. And it's interesting. I was thinking about a firm that's no longer with us called Bear Stearns, and I was thinking about the chairman, how he always made his people who are making often a lot of money give back. And there was a percentage of time or money. And I think coming from a family who I was raised that's part of who I should be and am, and I always felt like that was the only way to be. Yet I surround myself with people that aren't that way, and I always feel guilty about having to be neutral when I'm around people who have tons and tons and tons of money. And how do we as a society make them feel good about buying art and giving back? And I'm putting that out there to you because I know that's like this utopian world, and perhaps this is, not, but how do you, without making people feel badly or guilty about it, and how can we maybe make that so important that a percentage of anything that we give, because we often see people who are the littlest give the most. So if you could share on maybe your perspective or how we could do that. Thank you so much.
I think that was a great program at Bear Stearns, and they had a leader who understood the importance of it. When I raise money, part of what I'm doing is letting people want to do good. Many of us know this, many of us don't. And I am inviting them to be part of doing something good. And we joke sometimes that I think I'm doing people a favor to donate to us. But I think it comes from leadership and the experience of giving and then feeling part of a community that is doing good. And since so much, I think it's in us somewhere. And so we need to somehow help those people to feel the good of doing good. So I don't know how we get them to do that, but if you want to do like a cocktail party at your house, we'll allow them to do good for the Urban Justice Center.
What about you, Liana? What's your thoughts on that?
Guilting people does not make them give more money. I mean, I have my tactics with my board, but as a funder and as also someone who works very deeply as a development chair for a Jewish LGBTQ organization called Keshet, it's really about narrative. It's really about how you connect with people and pull them in and not being one-sided about it and engaging them to find out what they're actually interested in and being able to find those touch points for them to experience the work of a nonprofit that is organic and not forced and not performative. There's nothing that makes me more sad than when people want to give me a presentation about their goals and their dreams and like, here's our metrics and here's these testimonials, and we're sitting here listening to people's stories that are deeply personal and moving, and we feel, oh, wow, they're doing such great work, but like for me, I'm like, no, let me talk to the people that you work with. Let's go and see and do. And I know it's been a strange couple of months, and hopefully we'll be moving past these couple of months. But I think that even on Zoom, there's ways to engage and connect with people, and just finding new ways of just creating conversation, and making people feel wanted and needed without them feeling like they have to do something just because they have wealth.
I'm actually very proud to say at Nixon Peabody, our firm, we launched into the idea of building out an art collection. And I tapped my personal curator and my wife, Tracy. But we set out a dialogue with our community that the work we would acquire would be from emerging artists, would be from a diverse group of artists, that we would create a comfortable environment within our environment of a law firm that tried to send the message to everybody who was working there that you're part of this, everybody's part of this conversation. We have a beautiful work by E.J. Hill, who was an interesting artist at Made in LA, and he, as for his performance piece, he stood dressed as a runner for, 2 months or something crazy.
8 hours a day
8 hours a
for
day.
2 months, for the entirety of the exhibition.
For the entirety of the exhibition, and then we bought a painting from it. And the conversations that allows us to have with our colleagues, with others, and the fact that we bought EJ's work now allows EJ to keep doing more work. And so I think you should be very, very proud of that fact. And just to sort of close the loop on the circle, I was able to here today to meet the Urban Justice Center's former general counsel, who's now doing that job at a private firm and pushing that private firm, I imagine, to maximize its impact. And my former partner, Kristen Giamardino, is now the general counsel of the Urban Justice Center. And I'm very proud to have worked with her for a number of years and helped train and help her be in a position where she could go to the Urban Justice Center and now make an impact at the Urban Justice Center. So I think sometimes we're a little too hard on ourselves. I do think that we are, through the art world and the legal world and the philanthropic world, we are making impact, we are working hard, we are working well-intended. I think we're cutting across political lines. And I do think I would encourage you all to keep doing whatever little bit you can on that effort.
Just a quick extra sentence. I think people who donate are doing something good, and I think they feel good, and it's positive, and somehow you have to get them across the line to see that it's actually a selfish thing to give because they're going to do something good for themselves.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank Eliza Osborne for asking me to be part of this panel. I want to thank Liana, and I want to thank Doug and their respective staffs and boards for being supportive of us doing this panel. And I wish you a delightful Saturday, particularly in remembrance of 20 years ago here.
Thank you.